They mocked her from the minute she walked onto the range. But when Tasha Merriweather raised her weapon, one shot changed everything they thought they knew. The gravel crunched under Tasha Merriweather's boots as she stepped out of her car, clutching a modest gear bag against her side. The sun was already beating down hard over the flatlands of Pflugerville, Texas, and the wide, open shooting range looked just as dry and unforgiving as the air around it. Tasha adjusted the strap of her bag and glanced around. Wooden benches lined the front of the range. Men in faded ball caps and work shirts leaned back, sipping from dented thermoses, talking low and laughing between puffs of cigarette smoke. She could feel it already. The sideways glances, the slight pauses in their conversations. At 42, Tasha had walked through enough rooms to know when she wasn't expected, and wasn't exactly welcomed. But she wasn't new to feeling out of place. Being one of the few black women in her nursing program all those years ago had taught her how to square her shoulders and keep moving. She hadn't come out here for anyone's approval. She was here for herself. Still, a flicker of nerves jumped in her stomach as she headed toward the sign-in desk. A tall man with sunburned cheeks and mirrored sunglasses barely looked up as she approached. His voice was dry, almost disinterested. "First-timer?" he asked, eyes lingering on her jeans and basic equipment bag. "No," Tasha replied simply, offering a small smile. "Just haven't been here before." The man scribbled something on the sheet and jerked his thumb toward the firing lanes without another word. Tasha signed her name, neat and careful, and made her way to a far station away from the main group. She could still hear a few of the men chuckling among themselves, one of them muttering something about city folks thinking they can shoot. She took a deep breath, laying out her gear. A simple 9mm pistol, nothing fancy, cleaned and maintained with care. Next to it, a small box of ammunition, neatly arranged. She pulled her earmuffs up over her ears and adjusted her stance. She could hear her grandfather's voice in her head, low and calm from all those afternoons on his farm in Bastrop. "Steady hands, steady heart, baby girl." Behind her, she felt the weight of eyes watching, silent, amused, waiting. But Tasha had long since learned not to perform for anyone. She squared her shoulders, loosened her knees, and focused on the paper target flapping gently at the other end of the lane. She hadn't fired a shot yet, but her heart was already pounding, not from fear, but from the thick silence gathering around her. She could feel it like humidity, heavy and uncomfortable. A couple of guys a few lanes over made a show of loading their rifles, loud and careless. One of them called out to his buddy, not bothering to lower his voice. "Bet she flinches." Tasha didn't react. She just loaded her magazine, slid it into place, and cocked the gun with a sharp, clean motion. The sound cracked through the air, cutting across the low laughter behind her. She set her feet, took one long, steadying breath, and raised the pistol. No one was laughing now. Out of the corner of her eye, she caught a few heads turning fully toward her. Some still grinning, others leaning back with crossed arms, ready to be entertained. But entertainment wasn't what Tasha came here for. She came to remind herself of who she was. And maybe, if they were paying attention, she'd remind them too. But Tasha hadn't pulled the trigger yet. And what happened next would leave everyone on that range remembering her name for a long time. The first shot cracked through the air like a whip, sharp and clean. For a fraction of a second, everything seemed to stop. Conversations cut off mid-sentence. Someone's thermos clattered to the ground. Tasha lowered her arms slowly, feeling the controlled recoil settle back into her muscles. She glanced toward the paper target, just to confirm what she already knew. Dead center. A clean hole right through the bullseye. The range officer, the man with the mirrored sunglasses, lifted his head fully now. His mouth parted slightly, just enough to show a flash of teeth. For a moment, no one said a word. Then a low whistle from the far end of the bench line, followed by a muttered, "Damn." Tasha reloaded casually, acting like she didn't hear it. She could feel the shift, though, a slow pulling back of assumptions, like a tide retreating. Some of the men turned back to their gear, pretending to be busy, but their shoulders were stiff, their movements rigid. Others stared openly, arms crossed, eyes narrowed with something that looked less like amusement and more like something else. Curiosity, maybe even respect. But there were a few, a small knot of 3, who weren't ready to give anything up. Tasha could hear them chuckling low, shaking their heads. "Fluke," one of them grunted under his breath. "Anybody can get lucky once." Tasha smiled to herself, the corners of her mouth tight with patience. She reset her stance without a word, focused on the next round. Another sharp shot, another dead center hit, almost touching the first. And another, and another. The paper target swayed slightly with each impact, the holes nearly overlapping into one ragged black scar in the middle of the sheet. Tasha didn't rush. She took her time, breathing evenly, hands steady, body loose but anchored. By the time she lowered her pistol again, the whole front line of shooters was pretending not to watch her, and failing miserably. The man closest to her, a heavy-set guy with a thick beard and a bright orange hunting vest, finally broke the silence. "Where'd you learn to shoot like that?" he asked, his voice a little too loud, a little too forced. Tasha pulled off her earmuffs and let them hang around her neck. She met his gaze squarely. "My grandfather," she said, "taught me when I was about 12. The bearded man shifted awkwardly, scratching the back of his neck. "Well, hell, guess he taught you right." A few others murmured in agreement, nodding reluctantly. But from the corner of her eye, Tasha saw the group of 3 troublemakers, the ones who'd laughed earlier, watching her with tight mouths and squinted eyes. Their posture wasn't friendly. It wasn't impressed either. If anything, it felt defensive, like her skill was some kind of threat. One of them, a wiry guy with a ball cap pulled low over his eyes, finally spoke up, his tone thick with sarcasm. "Yeah, okay. But bet you can't keep it up with a rifle." The bait hung heavy in the air. The others watched, waiting to see if Tasha would take it. She could have laughed it off, could have packed up and left, her point made. But Tasha didn't move. Instead, she tilted her head slightly, considering. "Got one I can borrow?" she asked calmly. The wiry man smirked, tossing a battered .22 caliber rifle onto the bench between them with a loud clatter. "Knock yourself out," he said. Tasha picked it up, checked the chamber, and loaded it like she'd done it 1,000 times, because she had. Her grandfather had made sure she knew her way around more than just a pistol. She took her position again, set her aim, and fired 3 quick, controlled shots in a tight triangle formation at the center of a fresh target. When she finished, she set the rifle back down with a soft clack and stepped aside. The wiry man's smirk faltered. Every shot had landed exactly where it was supposed to. But the looks on their faces weren't the only thing starting to change, and before long, Tasha's quiet power would shift the entire energy of that range. It didn't take long for word to travel down the firing line. A few people who hadn't been paying much attention before were now inching closer, trying to look casual. Some leaned back on their benches, others wiped their hands on their jeans and stood a little straighter, pretending they just happened to be facing her direction. Tasha stayed in her own world, reloading calmly, as if this sudden wave of attention didn't touch her. Inside, she could feel her chest tightening, not with nerves, but with an old, tired feeling she knew too well. That stubborn itch that told her, "You'll have to be better, cleaner, sharper, always." It wasn't fair. It never had been. But she'd learned not to waste time wishing for fairness. She focused on the next target. New paper, fresh and crisp. This time, the range officer himself wandered down the line, stopping a few feet behind her. He didn't say anything. Didn't have to. His crossed arms and slow nod were enough to show he was watching closely now. Tasha fired another round. Dead center. Another. Slightly off to the left, but still within the bullseye ring. Another. Sliced cleanly through the first hole like threading a needle. Each shot carried a crisp sound that felt heavier than just noise. It felt like permission, like a slow, reluctant opening of doors that most days stayed firmly shut. As she worked through her set, she caught bits of low conversation drifting behind her. "She's good. Real good. Better than half of us here." One man laughed, short and embarrassed. "Better than me for damn sure." The wiry man who had challenged her earlier didn't say anything this time. He was busy breaking down his own rifle, focusing too hard on the bolts and screws, pretending she didn't exist. Tasha didn't gloat. She didn't grin. She simply kept moving, calm and measured, the same way her grandfather taught her. In between rounds, she wiped her palms on her jeans, more out of habit than need. Her mind flickered briefly to her kids back home, Jordan, who was 16 and already taller than she was, and Mia, just turned 9, who still insisted on sleeping with a nightlight. Tasha thought about how she wanted them to see her one day, not just as their mom, but as someone who didn't back down, even when things got uncomfortable. Another shot. Another bullseye. One of the older men down the line, grey hair curling out from under his baseball cap, finally broke the growing tension. "You teach classes?" he called out, half joking, half serious. Tasha smiled without looking up. "No, sir," she said. "Just learned to listen good." There was a ripple of quiet laughter. Not mocking this time. Genuine. Respectful. For the first time all morning, the air around her shifted from heavy to light. People started to talk more freely, comments flying back and forth. Questions about what kind of training she'd had, what brand of ammo she preferred, even a few sheepish admissions about struggling with accuracy themselves. It wasn't perfect. Some were still skeptical, still stiff with the kind of pride that made it hard to admit they were wrong, but the ice had cracked. And that was enough for now. Tasha lowered her weapon, carefully ejected the magazine, and set it aside. She had come here thinking it would be a lonely afternoon, maybe even a miserable one. She had braced herself for judgment, and she'd gotten it. But not for long. Because skill talks, patience talks, grace under fire talks louder than any whisper or sideways glance. But not everyone was ready to let go of their first impressions yet, and the real test for Tasha was still coming. The smell of gunpowder hung thick in the warm afternoon air as Tasha packed her pistol back into her case. She could feel the subtle difference now. Not just the curiosity or admiration, but something deeper, something harder to name. It was like the room had shifted its weight. Still, not everyone was ready to treat her as an equal. The wiry man who'd challenged her earlier, his name, she overheard, was Buck, kept shooting sideways glances at her, tight-lipped, hands fidgeting as he reloaded his rifle again and again. It was clear that losing face in front of the others had gotten under his skin. Tasha zipped up her bag slowly, staying quiet. She didn't need to rub anything in. But she also wasn't going to shrink herself just to make someone else comfortable. Buck finally snapped, slamming a magazine into place, louder than necessary, and stepping into the lane beside her. "You think you're better than everybody here?" he barked, voice sharper than the crack of gunfire. Tasha looked over calmly, blinking once. "No," she said. "I'm just here to shoot." Buck sneered, shaking his head. "Sure. Bet you think you're hot stuff because you got lucky a few times." From the bench nearby, the heavy-set man in the orange vest, the one who'd asked about her earlier, stood up slowly, wiping his hands on his jeans. His name, Tasha had caught earlier, was Roy. "That didn't look like luck to me," Roy said, his voice steady. A few others mumbled in agreement. Buck ignored them. He squared his shoulders, lifted his rifle, and fired a sloppy round downrange. The shot hit the target, but it was way off center, tearing the paper near the edge. Tasha said nothing. She didn't need to. Roy shook his head and walked over, standing between them now. "Look," he said, turning toward Buck. "You want to get better. You watch people who know what they're doing. You don't tear 'em down." Buck's jaw worked like he was chewing something bitter, but he didn't argue. He muttered something under his breath and stomped back toward the benches, slamming his rifle down louder than necessary. The tension eased like a stretched rubber band finally snapping loose. Roy turned back to Tasha, offering a nod. Not the stiff kind, but the real kind that said, "You've earned it. You come back next weekend," he said. "We got a little club, marksmen only. Could use someone like you." Tasha hesitated. She wasn't used to being invited, not in places like this. Her life had taught her that, often, those doors stayed closed no matter how hard you knocked. But she saw something genuine in Roy's face, and in the way some of the others had softened too. Not in pity, but in respect. "Maybe I will," she said, smiling slightly. Roy chuckled. "We even got a barbecue after. You bring that aim of yours, I'll bring the ribs." There was laughter again, easy and rolling across the firing line. For the first time all day, Tasha felt the tight knot in her stomach loosen. It wasn't about showing off. It wasn't about beating anyone. It was about standing firm in her own skin, knowing she had nothing to prove, and yet proving it anyway, not with words, but with action. She picked up her bag and slung it over her shoulder, catching a few lingering looks from others as she walked past. Not the curious or skeptical looks from earlier. Not the mocking ones either. Respect. Simple, earned respect. As she loaded her gear into her trunk, the sun dipping lower in the sky behind her, Tasha thought about how quickly judgment can turn into admiration when you refuse to shrink yourself to fit someone else's idea of who you're supposed to be. But before she could leave for the day, one more unexpected encounter would seal the lesson she hadn't even realized she was teaching. Tasha was wiping dust off her windshield when she heard footsteps crunching the gravel behind her. She turned casually, half expecting Roy again. But it wasn't him. It was one of the younger guys from the range. Tall, maybe mid-20s, with a crooked ball cap and a sheepish look that didn't quite fit his earlier smugness. His hands were jammed deep into his pockets, shoulders hunched like he wasn't sure if he should even be walking over. Tasha kept her expression neutral. She wasn't about to make this easy for him. He stopped a few feet away, rocking back on his heels. Hey," he said, scratching the back of his neck. "Name's Logan." Tasha nodded once. "Tasha," he hesitated, looking down at the ground, then back up at her face. His voice dropped lower, almost embarrassed. "I just wanted to say, you're really good, like seriously. Best shot I've seen here in a long time." Tasha crossed her arms lightly. "Thanks." Logan shuffled his feet, kicking a small rock aside. "And, he added, voice even lower now. "Sorry if me and the guys were, acting like jerks earlier." He glanced around like he was hoping no one else could hear him. Tasha studied him for a moment longer than was comfortable. She wasn't interested in punishing him. She wasn't even angry anymore. Mostly, she just wanted him to feel what it meant to show up honestly, even if it was messy, even if it was late. "It's easy to laugh when you don't know somebody," she said simply. "Harder when you have to look 'em in the eye." Logan nodded quickly, almost grateful she hadn't made it harder than it already was. "I guess," he said. "Just thanks for showing up. And for not, showing off about it." Tasha almost smiled. Almost. "Wasn't here to show off," she said. "Just here to shoot." He gave an awkward little laugh, nodding again, then backed away, almost bumping into his own truck in his hurry. Watching him go, Tasha felt something she hadn't expected. Not pride exactly, but something like hope. Maybe small moments like these mattered more than the big ones. She climbed into her car, the leather seat hot against her back, and sat for a moment before starting the engine. Across the lot, Roy and a few of the others were packing up too. She caught Roy's eye. He lifted a hand in a short wave, not casual, not meaningless, a real acknowledgement. She lifted her fingers slightly in return before pulling out slowly, the tires crunching on the gravel. As she turned onto the highway, the range shrinking in her rearview mirror, Tasha thought about how quickly opinions could change when someone had the courage to show what was true. Not just for a second, but over and over again, without apology. Respect wasn't something you asked for. It wasn't something you demanded. It was something you built, one brick at a time, even when people were determined not to see it. But there was still one more voice waiting to catch up with her. A voice that would leave her thinking about this day long after the dust had settled. The gas station just outside of Pflugerville was quiet when Tasha pulled in. She parked by the pump, letting the engine idle a moment longer than needed. The adrenaline from earlier had finally worn off, leaving a tired, buzzing kind of awareness in its place. She wasn't ready to drive the whole way home yet, not without a few minutes to let her mind catch up with everything that had happened. Inside, the store was cool and smelled faintly of old coffee and motor oil. Tasha grabbed a bottle of water from the cooler and stood in line behind a man in a faded flannel shirt. She barely registered him until he turned around, a brown bag tucked under one arm. It was Buck, the same wiry man who'd challenged her so hard at the range, standing less than 3 feet away, looking just as surprised to see her as she was to see him. For a second, neither of them moved. Then Buck cleared his throat awkwardly and shifted the bag higher up on his hip. He started, voice low. Listen. Tasha stayed silent, letting him figure it out himself. Buck took off his ball cap, running a hand through sweat-flattened hair. His face looked different now. Less hard, more worn. You're real good, he said finally. No sarcasm, no bite, just simple words, delivered rough like gravel, but true all the same. Tasha nodded once. Appreciate it. Buck hesitated again. His eyes dropped to the ground, then back up. Shouldn't have come at you like that, he muttered. Wasn't right. It wasn't an excuse. It wasn't even an apology in so many words. But Tasha knew enough about men like him, about people who carried pride like armor, to recognize when they were laying it down the only way they knew how. She took a slow breath and let it out. Sometimes, she said evenly, you gotta see something different to realize what you're missing. Buck looked at her for a long second, then gave a single nod. A real one this time. Yeah, he said gruffly. Guess you're right. He shifted his bag again and walked out without another word, pushing the door open with his shoulder. Tasha paid for her water and headed back to the car, the heat already rolling off the pavement in shimmering waves. She sat for a minute behind the wheel, sipping from the bottle, thinking. It would have been easy to be angry, easy to walk away from all of it with bitterness lodged deep in her chest like a splinter. But she didn't feel bitter. She felt steady, because today had been a reminder, not just to them, but to herself. People will judge you before they know you. They'll measure you by the shallowest parts of themselves. And sometimes, no matter how skilled you are, no matter how calm or brilliant or strong, some of them still won't want to change. But that's not your job. Your job is to stand in your truth, even when it's uncomfortable. Especially when it's uncomfortable. To be undeniable, not because you're loud, but because you're real. Tasha started the engine, pulling back onto the highway, letting the long stretch of road unfold ahead of her. She thought about Mia and Jordan again, and how someday they'd face their own moments of being underestimated, of being judged before they even opened their mouths. And she hoped they'd remember, not to fight for approval, not to bend themselves out of shape for acceptance, but to do what needed to be done with steady hands and a steady heart. But before Tasha's day officially ended, she still had one more decision to make, one that could turn today's lesson into a lasting legacy. The sun was dipping low when Tasha pulled into her driveway back in Taylor, Texas. Her neighbor's dog barked lazily from across the street, the air still heavy with the thick, slow heat of late afternoon. She sat for a moment, hands resting lightly on the steering wheel, staring at her small, tidy house, the porch light already clicking on automatically as the sky turned a softer blue. The events of the day replayed quietly in her mind. The snickers, the stares, the doubt thick enough you could almost taste it. And then, the shift, the crack in the wall, the quiet, reluctant respect. It would have been easy to chalk it up as a one-time thing. Just a few guys at a range who didn't know any better. But deep down, Tasha knew better. This wasn't just about shooting targets. This was about standing in front of judgment, in front of small-mindedness, fear, and assumptions, and refusing to shrink. It was about showing up, steady and sure, until there was no room left for anyone to pretend they hadn't seen what was real. She thought about Roy's invitation again. The Marksman Club. The chance to come back next weekend. Not as a stranger, not as someone to laugh at, but as someone they would have to take seriously. She hadn't given him an answer at the range. She hadn't needed to. Tasha smiled to herself as she finally climbed out of the car, feeling the warm gravel press through the soles of her boots. Inside, Jordan was sprawled on the couch, headphones slung around his neck, a half-eaten sandwich perched dangerously on the armrest. Mia was at the kitchen table, coloring intently, her small fingers smudged with bright crayon marks. Both of them looked up when she walked in. "Hey, Mama," Jordan called lazily. Mia grinned. "Did you win?" Tasha laughed softly, setting her keys down on the counter. "Something like that," she said. She ruffled Mia's hair on the way past, heart swelling unexpectedly in her chest. Because today wasn't really about hitting bullseyes or impressing a handful of strangers at some dusty range outside Pflugerville. It was about making sure these two kids grew up knowing exactly who their mother was, and maybe seeing a little of that in themselves. It was about laying down something solid under their feet, a belief that you don't have to fit anybody's expectations to belong. You just have to be willing to show up every time and let your actions speak louder than anything else. Tasha grabbed a glass from the cabinet and poured herself some sweet tea, leaning back against the counter as the house settled around her. Tomorrow, she'd call Roy and tell him she'd be there next weekend. She'd keep showing up, not because she had something to prove, but because she had something to live. Because every time you refuse to let someone else write your story, every time you stand tall and stay true, you make it just a little easier for the next person to do the same. And maybe, just maybe, that's how real change starts. Not with speeches, not with shouting, but with steady hands, a steady heart, and the courage to pull the trigger when it counts. If this story made you feel something, if it reminded you of a moment when you had to stand your ground, don't keep it to yourself. Share it. Subscribe to the channel. We've got plenty more stories coming your way. Stories about real people, real strength, and the quiet kind of courage that changes everything.